Cool. Well, firstly, absolutely lovely to be back here. Well done for making it almost to the end. I also love this room. I kind of imagine one day I'll speak in this room and like all up there there'll be people as well, but who knows. Anyway, I'm here to talk to you about speed. And first, I guess, a bit of a question. You ever worked in an organization where sometimes it feels a little bit like this? So maybe things just feel a bit slow, or they feel like they could be quicker if only you could like figure out what was kind of preventing you from going fast enough, being more efficient, delivering more value. Or, well, maybe you spend your time at conferences like this, or you look at other organizations, or you read blog posts, and it feels a bit like this. You're doing putting in all the effort you possibly can, and yet somebody just breezes past you, making it look effortless, like they got some sort of magic sauce or something. And you wonder to yourself, well, what could I do differently? Where can I get a bit of that from? How can I become like this? You may have already, by the way, noticed a theme through this presentation, but we'll come to that in a minute. So you might be wondering why I'm talking about this, why I think it's important, what it means to me. I've run engineering teams for, I guess, let's say longer than I probably would like to say, a while. I got quite a lot of the 90s jokes in the keynote, let's put it that way. And I've kind of seen teams where sometimes it just feels fast and it's brilliant, and then it starts to feel slow, it starts to feel frustrating. And it feels frustrating to everybody, whether you're the CEO, whether you're an engineer in an individual squad. So I want to kind of tell you a little bit about what I've seen has worked, some things I've tried. I also want to tell you quite a bit about professional bike racing, because I love bike racing and the Tour de France is on. So I've spotted at least a couple of people here that might be into bikes. So I feel passionately about bikes. I feel passionately about running great engineering teams. So this hopefully kind of brings it all together. And then let's see who wins the stage of the tour today. The other reason is, when I was putting this together, I thought, what else am I going to do in West Cornwall? So after this conference is over, I'm going to ride around West Cornwall on a route called the West Kerno Way. So that's my next 3 days, and the weather looks lovely. Anyway, that's enough. But then I started thinking a little bit more, and I started thinking about professional cycling, and I started thinking about the challenges and the problems that I've seen in my role. And I started to see some analogies between the two, some similarities. And I looked at a professional cycling team, and a professional cycling team will have an owner. So they'll have a boss. So this guy here, this is a guy called Patrick Lefevre. So he's the boss of the Quick Step Alpha Vinyl team. They won the first 2 stages of the Tour de France this year. So think of him a bit like maybe your VPE or your CEO, for example. He's the big boss. He makes the things happen. He's the one that you've got to get stuff through. He sets the scene. He sets the culture. And then you've got your sponsors in a cycling team. Now, it's no fluke that when you look at a professional cyclist jersey, there are sponsor logos plastered all over it. That's how you finance a professional cycling team. That's the only way money comes into the sport. They're a little bit like your stakeholders. Your boss, you, as a professional cyclist, for example, you want to keep your sponsors happy, you want to keep your stakeholders happy if you're in an engineering team. And then you've got your team. So your team has a team leader, maybe like this guy here, Mark Cavendish. It also has a number of different specialists. So you might have cyclists who are particularly good at climbing. You might have cyclists like Mark Cavendish who are particularly good at sprinting, but they're awful at climbing mountains. And how the team operates and how the team comes together to be a winning team is dependent on how all of those different people with different skill sets work together. And then you have your team. So your team, typically in cycling, has got about 25 people in it. They're not all in the same race. They're not all trying to hit the same goals at any one time. Some of them may be in a race. Some of them may be training. Sometimes they're in different races at the same time. So you've maybe got a core set of 7 to 8 in a cycling team, and then 25 people, and some of them are in other places. So I looked at this, I thought, that sounds a little bit like my engineering team. They're not all working on the same thing. Now, a little bit about me. So I am the VP Engineering for a company called Bloom & Wild. So We are Europe's leading online flower delivery company. So we do flowers 3 letterbox to your doorstep, now in 8 different countries. 3 different brands. We acquired 2 companies, which I'll talk a little bit about in 2021. So quite a new thing for us. There's about 60 people in engineering, about 70 in technology. When I joined almost 5 years ago, there were 10 in technology and about 35, I think, in the whole company. So I've seen the company go from little scrappy, fast-paced startup to scale up. And a lot of that is what forms my opinions that you'll see today. Also, the astute amongst you might have seen, like, if you only want to come here and buy some nice cheap flowers off us, by all means, go on our site and stick the word Steve in there, because you'll get 15% off. It's my little flower gift to you all. Cool. So, really, why am I talking about this? It's be super indulgent to stand up here and just talk about professional bike racing, because this is an Agile conference. So, when I joined, as I say, Bloom Wild, it was 2017, there were 10 people in technology, everything got done super quickly. So everybody knew everybody else, everybody knew who they needed to go to get something done. There were 10 engineers, they were working in a reasonably, at that time, mature code base. We could go from an idea to something shipped really quickly, in sometimes a matter of hours. And as the company started to grow linearly, we started to incrementally add more and more people to the engineering team. And then, a couple of years back, it's come up in so many presentations, unsurprisingly, over the last 2 days, the pandemic happened. And we were in a very, very fortunate position. Our mission is to make life a little more thoughtful and beautiful. We were able to enable people to be a little more thoughtful and spread a little bit more love in the world through a horrible period. Now, that was also rather good for us from a trading perspective. And what that meant is, it meant that we scaled and started to scale much, much more quickly than we had planned to do. And that included in the engineering team. We started scaling the engineering team at sort of 45% a year and really, really ramping things up. Now, doing that, and while we did that, we also acquired 2 companies in order to expand further in Europe. But what happened to our ability to react quickly? What happened to our ability to ship value and understand whether we were doing the right things and whether we were doing that in an aligned enough way? That was a lot harder, and particularly done quickly. So I want to tell you a little bit about some things we did that I think have worked. Hopefully, some of them may be useful to you. So, first thing to think about is, what does slow really mean anyway? To me, as a VPE, it means at some point or some points, I'll be sitting at my desk, or whether at home or in the office, and maybe my CEO or one of our exec will come to me and they will say, feels like the engineering team's getting a bit slow. Do you agree? And the first time I got that kind of question, I was like, what do you mean? It's not slow. Look at all this value. But then I thought, actually, let's strip that question back a little bit. What does slow actually mean? So if an engineering team is running slow, what's running slow? Is there less getting done? Well, less of what? So is it less JIRA tickets getting done, less commits being made, less something else? I don't know. Or maybe it's less getting done per person or per, let's say, unit of investment. Less getting done per pound spent on the engineering team, for example. Maybe we're beginning to get somewhere here. Maybe we're beginning to think a little bit about a return on that potential investment and why we're actually doing something. Maybe it's the stakeholders not getting what they wanted. Do they know what they want? Have you explained what you can deliver to them? Have you set expectations? Or maybe it's your CEO. Again, your most senior stakeholder not getting what they wanted. Have you managed their expectations effectively? Do you manage upwards? Or it could just be this. And it's normally just this. Some vague feeling it's not as fast as it used to be. So if less is getting done, what can we do about it? I think there's 4 things we can do. So we can think about communication. Communication is at the heart of what slows teams down. Poor communication. communication is largely driven by organization. And so we can think about, in our organizational design, how can we design an organization that limits scope, provides the right level of support for the people within that organization? And then, as an organization grows bigger, how can we ensure that things are aligned? How can we use techniques such as objectives and key results, KPIs, thinking about return on investment? And then, because they're all very hard measures, how can we actually think about teams and people through things like charters? And if it just feels slow, what does slow even mean in the first place? How can we measure it? How can we do a better job of explaining what we need to do, why we need to do it? How can we prioritize better, and how can we design that focus in? So let's go through these one by one. So firstly, communication. So back to professional bike racing. So in professional bike racing, the peloton is followed around by a lot of team cars. And what the team cars do is they have spare bikes on them in case any of the riders get a puncture or smash their bike up. They have food, they have water and drinks and stuff in there. And they're basically there to service the needs of the riders. So they're kind of like the riders' support network. We all need a support network. Now, they keep in contact with the riders by radio, and the riders themselves keep in contact with each other by radio. So if, for example, you're the team leader and you want the rest of your team to bring you to the front of the peloton, to the front of the group of riders, you'll radio them, because you can't shout at them in a peloton moving at 60 kilometers an hour with 180 people in it. They'll get the message, they'll come and join around you, and they'll bring you up. So how does information get disseminated in your team or your company? Because this is the challenge. When you scale quickly, you can miss this sort of step, and you can miss thinking about things like this. So this is effectively, if you've got 3 people, think about the connections between those people. It's quite simple. 3 people have 3 connections, ultimately. But the minute you start to add more people, you don't have 4 people, 4 connections. You have, or 5 people, 5 connections. You have 5 people, it becomes 10 connections. But then if you start adding people by a couple more people, you've suddenly got 21 connections. You've got 36 connections. It now starts to get very complicated, but it looks a bit more pretty. 55, 78, 105, 17 people. So you've only gone up by 14 people, which when you're scaling an engineering team rapidly can happen in the blink of an eye if you get your hiring right. Suddenly there's 136 connections between all those people. Nobody can keep that number of connections alive. Now, if you like a bit of maths, there is actually a formula you can use to calculate this. So if you want to laugh, you want to go for the number of connections in the team you work in or the company you work in, you can plumb the number in there, and it'll probably, I would expect for most of you, come up with an incredibly huge number. Now, the way to solve this is by the right team structure. And one thing that's really important with the right team structure, and I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of this, is to take things like Dunbar's number into account. So Dunbar's number, an idea from a British anthropologist called Robin Dunbar, it's the number of effectively connections that us as humans can maintain. So we may have a close group of, say, for example, 5 friends. We may have a bigger group of 15. I think Dunbar referred to it as the number of people you wouldn't be embarrassed to join for a drink if you bumped into them informally in a bar. The interesting one here is 150. So 150 is the point at which you're sitting in the back of your office, if you still sit in the back of an office, and you look out and you go, who the hell is that? So organising your team with Dunbar's number in mind, and with these numbers in mind, can be a way, and it's a way that I found has actually been really useful about limiting the number of connections day to day that people need to keep, and therefore the cognitive load on them, and therefore the number of connections they keep in order to remain engaged and ultimately the team to be high performing. So in Blue Moire, we started with one team. It was called Blue Moire Technology, and it had 10 engineers in it when I joined in 2017. And then we started to add a few people. So we split into 2 different teams. We didn't have a very scalable naming convention for those teams. The next team wasn't called Ampersand, by the way. But in this first model and this second model, everybody knew everybody else. Everybody knew who to talk to, where to go. You could put everybody in a room. So mechanically it worked. You could have a stand-up with everybody in it. You could began to stretch a bit at 16, if I'm perfectly honest. But then we added more people and we went to this model. So 8, 8, and 8, 24. Now at that point, it really cracks. You don't put 24 people in one big circle and try and get them to talk to each other, because somebody who's working in a growth squad focused on acquisition marketing, with the best will in the world, doesn't really care so much what's happening in your fulfillment center, in your operations team, and they don't care so much about that technology. So what you do then is you do this. So you limit the scope of what people care about. You split into smaller squads. You establish clear business and technology domain ownership for those squads, and that really limits the scope of what people have to care about. They care most about the piece their squads own, reduces their cognitive load. This is the book we used as our inspiration, and I would very, very, very much recommend reading Team Topologies. It's an extremely good book. At its heart, there's two fundamental laws, effectively, that it's built on. One, Conway's law, i.e. Organizations are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures in those organizations. And then, effectively, therefore, if you design your organization with the communication structures and the architecture in mind that you want, those two things will map. And scaling teams according to that Dunbar's number. So Team Topologies is great, and I would really, really recommend reading it. In case you don't want to read it, this is effectively Team Topologies in one slide. So there are different sorts of teams in the topologies model. There's a stream-aligned team, which is aligned to your business outcomes, cross-functional, and effectively can deliver independently and independent features that fulfill a particular business need. You then may have a platform team. Now, your platform team is effectively there to own your underlying platform, to support your stream-aligned teams, and effectively simplify complex technology on behalf of those streamlined teams. You may also have, if you've got a particularly complicated part of your technology stack, you may have a team that owns that particular part, irrespective of whether it's aligned to a business area or not, i.e. a complicated subsystem team. And you may have some sort of enabling team, which I've kind of shown in the grey up the top there, which is effectively there to help those stream-aligned teams understand and pick up new technologies or new ways of working. And these teams can interact in different ways. So they can interact in a collaborating way, i.e. they work very closely together, particularly with an enabling team. They could work on an as-a-service model. We found this works quite effectively with our platform team. We're moving from a monolith to a microservices architecture. The platform team have designed a microservices template and archetype that the stream-aligned teams can then use to quickly spin up and build microservices. So that's as a service, effectively. And then you could have a facilitating mode, effectively one team helping another team. So how have we applied this in Bloom World? So if you remember, this is Bloom World to probably about 2018 with our stupid naming convention, which we then got sensible about on the bottom one. We've built, at this stage, we were building mostly on two different monoliths, so a front-end monolith and a back-end monolith, the Ruby on Rails application. So this is what we look like now. So much bigger, 70 people, multiple teams. But what we've done is we've taken our customer journey. So we are effectively retail, but of perishable goods. So from when you discover us, whether you've come in through acquisition marketing or however, and then you browse, you then buy something. We then effectively fulfill your order, and if you have an issue with that order, you may wish to return that. How's our customer services, customer support work? And then effectively, how do we get you to come back and buy more stuff? So we now have 9 squads in this model, organized into teams. Because the thing is, even if you spread 9 squads across this model, each squad owning their own little piece of the business domain, and also ideally their own part of the architecture as well, it will still get very complicated. There'll still be a too high a cognitive load, effectively, on some in that stack. So we have teams, which are the white boxes, an e-commerce team, which is effectively a grouping of those squads. So again, it's basically just limiting in the cognitive load. So you can think of those squads, they're stream aligned in the team topologies model. Our platform team is the platform team in the team topologies model serving those stream aligned teams. So going back to a professional cycling analogy, it's a little bit like having a cycling team and they may be at two races at the same time and 3 of their riders might be out on a training camp. They're all working on different things. So these teams are all working on goals that contribute to the company goals, but not necessarily all the same goal at the same time. Now, once you split things up, you need to figure out ways of gluing them back together again. So we glue ours together in 2 ways. So we glue them together in terms of a set of principles for our squads. So these are the principles that we set for our squads. And then we glue those squads together through tech leads and through communities. So communities are really where the engineers who work on a particular code base, maybe like they work on a Ruby monolith, for example, that's effectively where they get their peer-to-peer support. It's through their own community of practice internally, and we find that works to glue things together. And then those communities and the whole piece is glued together by a forum of tech leads. Now, I'd love to talk loads about communities because I love talking about communities, but I don't have time to talk about communities, and Emily Webber has written an absolutely brilliant book on communities, so I would really recommend, if you are interested in communities of practice, buying that book and reading it, because it's very, very, very good. But what this does is it enables us to be able to have clearer decision making. So let's say we have the business strategy feeding in, and we have the squads. Business strategy will lead to some sort of, or company strategy will lead to some sort of business or technology initiative. Now, that might be a really obvious initiative, and we may be able to say, okay, great, obvious solution, goes straight to the squads or the squad. So let's say, I don't know, we need to change the buy button to blue because we think that's going to increase the conversion rate by 2.5%. We don't need to go through a whole bunch of decision making for that. We just push it into the squad that owns the buy button. Whereas if we say we want to go to a microservices architecture, that's clearly going to take quite a lot more alignment. So that more alignment comes through our tech leads forum, and that's effectively where all of the leads from all of the relevant squads can come together, assess, and strategize. And then that high-level direction can be pushed into each of the squads. And then our communities of practice can then glue things together and can then effectively make sure that those engineers are all supported then as they actually go from what's an initiative, a strategic initiative, to something that's actually then in a delivery phase. So this limits the scope, ultimately, of what people need to care about, and it makes the communication paths explicit. So from an organizational perspective, it really comes down to 3 things. So limit the scope of what people care about, limit their cognitive load, make sure that they've got places for support, make sure there are places for shared learning, like the communities, and make sure that there's a clear decision-making path, and make sure that it is clear how and who makes those decisions. But how do you ensure you're aligned? So this is a commissaire's car in a bike race. So the commissaires are a bit like the referees of a bike race, basically. They're like the jury, and they're there to basically make sure that the rules of the road are followed, the rules of the race are followed, and effectively aligning the needs of the riders to the needs of the bike race and the surrounding environment. Because cycle racing is very unique in the sense that it takes place on the open road. And they're kind of here to make sure things like this don't happen. So when a bike race is planned, they look at how fast they think the riders are going to go. And then if the race is going to cross a train track, they make sure there isn't going to be a train coming. And if the riders have gone too quickly or too slowly, the commissaire should be in the place where if the barriers come down, they stop them, because bike riders stop for trains, trains don't stop for bike races. The commissaire was in the wrong place. It's crazy, that, isn't it? Absolutely crazy. So there's 4 different ways, I think, that I've found successful to align teams. So there's OKRs, objectives and key results, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, that can really help guide top-down alignment. There's KPIs, and KPIs, key performance indicators, that once you know your goal, you can use to assess whether you're on the right track to get there. There's return on investment and understanding before you do something what it's likely to cost, and continuing to understand what you're investing in so you can decide whether you continue doing it or not. And then for balance, there is how do you align your team? And I really firmly believe team charters is a very effective way of aligning a team and setting shared expectations. So let's start with OKRs. So OKRs are not a new concept. They started in the 1970s with, I think, Andy Grove at Intel. They got very popular. We found them actually very successful. There's a piece on OKRs which I think people often forget. So you've got your objective, your single what you want to do. You've got your key results, i.e. how are you going to achieve that what. But it's intended as a way of aligning an entire organization. So using an example, here is Mark Cavendish. So Mark Cavendish is the most successful British sprinter of all time, winner of 34 stages of the Tour de France, winner of the World Road Race Championship in 2011. He wants to win a race. So that's his big objective. He wants to win a race. But how's he going to win the race? So he thinks to win that race, if he gets to a kilometre from the finish and he's got enough energy to sprint at 1,200 watts, which is a heck of a lot of power, but he is very fast for 30 seconds, that will make him quicker than everybody else in the bike race. He will win the bike race. So that's one of his key results. That's his big objective. So think of him, this is the big objective for the team, win the race. Now this is a guy called Mikhail Morkov. He's the lead-out man for Mark Cavendish. So what Mikhail Morkov does is he sits in front of Mark Cavendish so that Mark Cavendish doesn't have to pedal so hard in the last few kilometres, and he basically muscles all the other riders out of the way so that Mark Cavendish is at the front when he wants to start sprinting, so people are not getting in his way. So his objective is to get Cav to the line, or to a kilometre from the line, with enough energy to sprint. His key results are different because his key results are reflected in what he needs to do that helps Cavendish achieve his key result, which achieves his objective. And this is some guy whose name I don't know because I got this picture off the internet, who is a soigneur for Quick Step, who hands out bottles and drinks. And his objective is to make sure that all of the riders have enough fluids, enough carbs, so that they've got enough energy, so that they can get Mikhail Morkov and everybody else to the line. So OKRs, this is a super simplistic example, really help alignment if they're trickled down effectively. And I have deliberately skipped a step between Mikhail Morkov and the guy holding the bottle. What we found is, together with a regular planning cycle, so a long-term plan of 12 months, but realistically a tighter plan of 3 months, that we found OKRs can really help us focus, and they can, in that 3-month period, really help us say, do we carry on doing this thing, or actually is this not the priority anymore? Do we course correct? So that's OKRs. KPIs, however, are your way of basically saying, I need to get to this objective, but am I getting there right? Do I actually have much chance of getting and achieving that objective? So in cycling terms, you could think of them as something like what's called functional threshold power, which is effectively how hard can you pedal for an hour before you can't pedal anymore? Because that tells a bike racer, if they keep pedaling like that, they're not going to be able to recover, and they're probably not going to finish the race or meet their objective in a race. So there's a couple of we found useful. The very, very popular, very much recommend reading Accelerate if you haven't before. Accelerate focuses on 4 key KPIs. Deployment frequency, i.e. how often you're pushing code into production. Your lead time, i.e. what's the time between when you start something, particularly, say, when you make a first commit, and when that actually is realizing value in production. Your change failure rate, how often do you push something that breaks something? And then your time to restore service, i.e. if it broke something, how quickly did you get your service back up and running? These have become phenomenally popular in the time that I've been at Bloom Wild, and they're a very good base set to use. More recently, Nicole Forsgren in particular, one of the co-authors of Accelerate, is promoting the idea of space metrics. And what these do is these add another additional piece to that metric set of taking into account satisfaction, developer productivity, for example. So I guess they're a little bit broader. So looking at satisfaction and well-being through things like health checks, performance, i.e. things like reliability, how satisfied a customer is. Activity, so an activity metric's a good example is deployment frequency. So kind of lifted through the DORA set. Metrics around communication that we talked about earlier, very important. And then a metric around efficiency and flow. Now, if you're interested in this sort of stuff, this link here is really, really good to go to. It's a very big paper on this sort of stuff. I don't think it's made it into a book yet. It's very, very well worth reading. Because having KPIs like this and starting from something which is kind of known and trusted, I found has really been useful. Now, we've kind of built on this, and we've done two things in Bloom and Wild. So we use a broader KPI set. These are all our KPIs. So some of them do map to say, DORA metrics, for example, cycle time, equivalence to lead time. But what we found's really, really worked is tying it to a narrative. So tying it to something so it doesn't sound like, hey, you're just doing the DORA metrics because you read Accelerate last night and it's really trendy. But tying it to this sort of narrative makes it very easy to understand and very easy to socialize what these metrics and these KPIs actually mean. And we found this actually works really, really effectively. So this is like our dashboard, basically. We have a dashboard of these, and this tells me whether we're on track or not, generally, and also whether a particular squad's on track. What we don't do, and there's a real anti-pattern in here, is we don't use this to compare squad A with squad B. So this is about aggregating to look at the engineering team. So you've got your objectives, you've got your planning cycle, you've got your KPIs. The next thing you really want to look at is return on investment, ROI. If you can't measure why you're doing something, what you're investing in something, and what the intended return is going to be, if you can't go to your product folks and say, what's the intended return on this? And if they can't give you an answer, think very seriously about whether you should be doing something in the first place. Because otherwise it's, yeah, it'll be all right. This is going to be successful, isn't it? We'll find market fit, don't worry. What I found quite useful when I used to engineering manage is to actually know how much your team actually costs to run. So I used to run the operations squad that was on a previous slide. That used to cost £5 a minute. So as well as being a quite amusing thing to pull up occasionally when everyone turned up to stand up 5 minutes late, it was actually very, very useful because you say, okay, if we're going to use this many sprints to do this thing, if it's going to take 2 sprints, and this is what it's going to cost. What return are we actually intending to get from this? Is it even worth doing this particular piece of work? But don't purely focus on hard metrics, because if you purely focus on hard metrics, you're going to miss the really important part of this, and this is the team and your team. Now, I found the single best thing for alignment of teams is charters. So charters are kind of like the rules of the game of a team, effectively. So it's a set of principles the team live by. This is an example of a real charter. You can do when you set a team up, doing an exercise like this can be really, really useful. When a team has been running for a while, redoing an exercise like this can be really useful because teams change, people leave, people join. It changes the dynamics in a particular team. One other thing that I found super useful here with charters is if you get a group of people in a room and you say, hey, what do we want to be? Tell me about the perfect team and how great it's going to be. Everyone goes, yeah, it's going to be nice. We'll do stuff. Tell them ask them to tell you what the worst team in the world is. And people will be slapping post-it notes on the wall for 5 or 10 minutes. Then all you need to do is just do a reversal exercise on that and say, okay, if the worst team in the world always turns up late, what does the best team in the world do? They turn up on time. Is this how we want to be? So I found charters really, really, really powerful. So powerful, a while ago I wrote something about it on our company tech blog. So if you're interested, there's a link. Cool, so let's say you've got the focus, you've got a super happy, efficient team, and CEO or somebody still coming up and going, just feels a bit slow, doesn't it? Well, first off, if it does feel slow to someone, it probably is. So don't just get defensive. do these things. So firstly, find out what the norm is in the organization you work in. So I've worked in like Bloom and Wild, little startup, became a scale up. I've also worked for Nokia, and speed of execution in Bloom and Wild and speed of execution in Nokia, very, very different. Nokia, happier, much more to kind of plod along. Maybe if they didn't plod along quite so much, we'd all still have Nokia phones, not iPhones. But key point here is, find out what the norm is. Ask your leaders what outcomes they want to see and what the organizational norm is. And then measure it and show it. Build it into your KPIs. If you've got dashboards and KPI dashboards, socialize them and share them. Make them universally available. Don't just hide them and make them an engineering team thing. Make them accessible. Learn how to distill complexity. So if somebody says this is a bit slow, do they really know the complexity of, for example, building software? Probably not. Do they know that as code bases get larger and larger and technical debt gets greater and greater, as Sally's going to talk about in the keynote in a few minutes, that all has an impact on how efficient a team can run. It's a job as a leader to socialize all of this. And tie it all back to business value. So if you're struggling to prioritize, say, technical debt, for example, can you quantify the value of doing it? Can you quantify it in a way that leadership will understand and not just engineering? Think about how you can tie that back. Because that's really what it's about. If you can, from an engineer upwards, learn how to talk like a C-suite, then you're in a much better position. So I love this photo. It's like poor Chris Froome stuck there. He just wants to go and ride his bike, doesn't he? Look, he's just got, get me out of there. But the key thing here is understanding what your technical debt is. So understanding what that means in real debt terms. So what is your company, what does your CEO really care about? What really matters to them? What really matters financially to the company? Is it, for example, the number of customers that you can acquire? Is it the lifetime value of those customers? Is it the amount you have to spend giving unnecessary discounts to people because you've got so many bugs in your fulfillment platform it keeps forgetting to dispatch orders for you? Understand what these things are, because then you can tailor your message in a way that makes sense. Because if you understand what they really care about, and you can do it like that, and ultimately you can put it in words that make sense. Like, for example, we've had to give discounts of 5% in the last month because of these bugs in our overcomplicated fulfillment platform. That sounds good. If, oh God, there's spaghetti code in the fulfillment platform and it's really brittle and all the engineers hate working in it, people don't care about that stuff quite so much. And make sure your message is tailored, make sure it's data-driven. And this is where your KPIs can really help you. If you've got a good KPI set already, you've already got a data set. And you can just work out how to use that data set to fuel your narrative. If you don't have a data set, it's a lot harder. And I found in the past, if somebody comes up to you and says it feels a bit slow, you probably don't want to give an answer in a week's time. You probably want to be a bit quicker than that. And if you can get better at doing that, you can get better at effectively talking like a C-suite and explaining the value, then you should also be able to get better at starting everything and finishing nothing. Because at the very heart of it, it's actually quite simple. So if you feel like everything's slow because there's so much work in progress, step number one, recognize you've got a problem. It's amazing how many organizations don't do this, or they micro-analyze it. So it's a problem in this squad or a problem in this squad, rather than an overall problem. And then make one view of everything. So if it feels slow, you probably have overloaded teams, you probably have an overloaded organization. So take a view of everything. And then find a way of comparing that work. So I find an Eisenhower matrix very useful. But find a way of taking your entire backlog, whether it's a portfolio backlog, strategic backlog, whether it's an individual backlog, and prioritizing the things in those backlog. And then commit to that prioritized list. And then start. It's really that easy. No, let's have a little example here. I think that would be much more valuable. Let's say we have 3 squads. So let's say we have an acquisition and discovery squad, a checkout squad, and a logistics squad. And let's say they're working on 3 things. So let's say they're working on fantastic, very nice, very exciting augmented reality flowers, shopping missions, and plants. Now, with no prioritization, everything's important. There's a tangled mess of stuff. Everybody starts everything. Nothing gets finished. And everything's slow because there's far too much WIP. Now, let's say we did use something like an Eisenhower matrix, so effectively importance versus urgency, which is far, far better than trying to rank these from top to bottom, because if you rank things from top to bottom, or you use high, medium, low, almost all the time everything ends up in medium, and then you can't prioritize anything, or everything ends up in a list. Everyone argues about why they can't put 40 things in a prioritized list. So this can work quite effectively. And you probably want to go for the most important, most urgent things. And then you can prioritize them, and you can use that to then feed into how your squads operate. So effectively, if you've got a squad which is working on something which is lower down that priority list, and they are free and they can compartmentalize that particular piece of work, great, they start on it. But if they can't, and they need to be contributing to something else, they should be contributing something higher up that priority list. If you do this and you regularly reassess this stack as things change, then you have yourself a very simple prioritization mechanism. But all the way through all of this, don't forget this. Don't forget teams of people. It's not just about delivering things. And so also think about how you actually measure and understand the health of your particular team. So I found health checks really, really good for this. Originated in Spotify, effectively a set of questions that you get the team to red, amber, green. And we find it good because we do this at the same time, and then all the feedback comes in from all of the engineering squads, and then we can aggregate it up. So let's say, for example, we get something like this, and everyone thinks releasing is a bit painful. We're probably wasting a lot of money. We're probably wasting a lot of money because maybe we didn't invest in our platform team enough. And maybe our engineers aren't focused on engineering. They're focused on doing platform things. Or maybe nobody is focused on what will make the engineering team most efficient. So for example, let's say it takes 20 minutes to do a build. Let's say you add a few more engineers. Then you're maybe taking 80 minutes in a day to do builds, in my super simplistic 1 build a day example. Let's say we add some more engineers. Suddenly you're taking 160 minutes to do your builds. Let's say your squad is the one that costs £5 a minute, or 85p an engineer. And every time you make a build, it's costing you £240. Now, you don't do 1 build a day, you do multiple builds a day. Engineers also drift off and do other things when they're waiting for overlong builds to run. So you're wasting a lot more money than this, but you can put a monetary value on it, and that's a really valuable thing to use in any ROI conversation. So if you're the leader of a particular team in this particular situation, what's your job? So sometimes it's to be on the front, taking the wind with the C-suite, explaining the value, explaining why things may have got slow, or maybe why people may have misunderstood, using your OKRs and your KPIs to tell your story. Oops, that's not the button I meant to press. Sometimes it's to be off the front, so getting teams to understand the value of a right setup, selling organizational changes to teams, explaining and aligning using OKRs and KPIs. And sometimes it's just to look cool riding on a horse next to them as they just motor along. This doesn't happen very often in one's career, but when it does, it's amazing. So it all comes down to this, ultimately. So communication and organization is about limiting scope, providing that support and alignment and that clear decision-making. Aligning, you can use OKRs and KPIs, you can measure your ROI, and you can use team charters to align the expectations of your teams. And if it feels slow, measure it. Learn how to explain why it is not slow using OKRs and KPIs to fuel your narrative and tell your story. Prioritize things like crazy. Make sure you're designing focus in. And above all, don't forget that this is all done by people. And teams are groups of people. So make sure you understand what they want and how they feel. So is this all easy? Of course it's not. If you were in Emma and Ella's presentation yesterday, you will know we're going through a subscriptions integration at the moment, which is proving a little challenging in some places. But make incremental progress, because the really important thing here is focus on one team, use them as the heroes if they do something really good, because small wins, magnified, mean a lot. Thank you. And buy these books, because they're great.